So the goal is to get a warning when we click this link here, and we want to be asked whether we really want to leave the page. So therefore, in this save link directive, we want to listen to clicks on the element to which this directive was added. And one way, and the main way of listening to such clicks, would be to use the host configuration option here on this directive configuration object. Because just as with the component decorator, the directive decorator allows us to add attributes or event listeners to the host element that is controlled or enhanced by this directive. So to this anchor element with this attribute here, in this case. And here I want to listen to click events, just as you learned it in the component section earlier in this course, by adding a key with this name to this host object. And as a value, we then specify the code that should be executed by Angular when that event occurs. And we're using this Angular event binding syntax here. That's what you also learned in the components deep dive section. Now, the code that should execute here is in the end a function that should be triggered. And therefore, I'll start by adding that function to this save link directive class, and I'll name it onConfirmLeavePage, but the name is up to you, of course. And in there, I can use window confirm to use a method built into the browser to ask the user, do you want to leave the app? And as a result, I'll get back a Boolean value, which I can store in a constant named wants to leave. And then we can check if wants to leave, so if the user wants to leave the page, in which case I'll return and not do anything. But else if wants to leave is false, so if you make it past this if check, I want to prevent the default of the event, which I expect to get here on onConfirmLeavePage, and that will be of type mouse event, which is a built-in type provided by TypeScript. And I want to prevent that default of that event to cancel this navigation that would otherwise be triggered by the anchor element. So with that, if the user chooses no, we will cancel that navigation. Now we just need to make sure that onConfirmLeavePage is triggered, and therefore here in this host setting, we should execute that and then pass this special $sign event variable that is provided by Angular here when using this event binding syntax to onConfirmLeavePage. And $sign event will be such a mouse event object that's automatically generated by the browser in the end when an anchor element is clicked. So that will trigger this method whenever the host element of this directive, which is this anchor element with this attribute, is being clicked. So with all that done, if we save that all, and you go back, if you click that first link where I did add that directive, you should get that dialog here. And if you click cancel, you should stay on this page. If you click OK, you should be navigated away. Because we either prevent that navigation or not, depending on what the user chose. But that's an example for an attribute directive that we can build ourselves to enhance built-in elements. In this case, anchor elements, so that we can easily add this confirmation feature here to any link in our application by simply putting that directive onto it. And that's why you sometimes might need directives, because they do allow you to add quick and easy enhancements like this. So we now saw how to build and use a custom attribute directive. But I'm not done with that yet, because you can add more features to your own directives. Because just like components, they, for example, also allow you to accept input values or emit outputs. And I want to accept an input value because I actually want to tweak the behavior of this directive a little bit or change what it does. To be precise, when the user chooses to leave the page, I want to be able to add some analytics query parameter to the address the user is about to navigate to. So if a user, for example, clicks this first link and confirms that they want to go there, I want to add a query parameter like from my app here, so that theoretically on that external page, they could track this query parameter if they wanted to. Now, I don't want to hard code this here into this link, which I could do, but I don't want to do that to keep these links here short and concise. But I want to add that query parameter when that directive here is active and the user confirmed that they want to leave. Now, how could we achieve this? Well, by going back here to the save link directive. And then as a first step, we need to get the address the user is about to navigate to if they want to leave. So we can get that address by accessing that event object which we get, and then there the target element, which will be the anchor element which was clicked. And therefore, there should be a href property on that target element, which will hold that value that was set for this href attribute here. Now, TypeScript is not convinced here because it's not convinced that the event target is necessarily an anchor element, but we know that it should be, and we can therefore use a special TypeScript syntax, which you haven't seen before, to convince TypeScript. We can use a feature called typecasting, where we add the as keyword here after a value for which we want to change the type TypeScript thinks this value is, and tell TypeScript with which kind of value we're dealing here. And here, this is an HTML anchor element. So by using this syntax, we convince TypeScript that event target will be of type HTML anchor element, and then we can safely access the ref property on that to get the address we want to navigate to. Well, and with that done, we can change that address to be address plus, and then we add the from query parameter like this, for example. With that, that query parameter should be added to the outgoing address when the user confirms that they want to leave. So with that, if we reload, if we click that first link and confirm this, you see this query parameter was added here. So that's one way of doing that. But now let's say we want to make that query parameter here configurable. It shouldn't necessarily be my app all the time. Instead, in the place where I'm using the directive, I'd like to set this dynamically. Or at least I'd like to have the option of setting this. So we could set this to my app, but also to my app-docs link, anything like that. And then here maybe it's my app courses link, whatever. So I'd like to be able to set different query parameter values here for that directive or for that input that we're about to add to that directive to make this directive configurable. Well, as I mentioned, that's no problem because you can accept inputs in your directives, just as you can do it on components. You can do this with the addInput decorator or with the input function. Again, just as with components. And here I'll go for the input function and not use the decorator. Now I'll add a new bindable input that could be named query param. And I turn it into an input by using the input function here, as mentioned. And I expect to get a string here, which should have a default value of my app. So in case this input is not set, I want to use my app as a fallback here, as a default value. And then down here where I assign that query parameter, I will set the from query parameter to the value this query param. And we need parentheses here since this is a signal, since I'm using the input function. With that, this would be configurable, but it's configurable on an input called query param. So in the learning resources template, we can't set it like this, but instead we add this directive, and then we add this separate query param input, like this. And I don't use square brackets around this input property here, because I'm not binding it to the result of some dynamic TypeScript expression, but instead to a string value. And as you learned earlier in the course, if you're setting some hard-coded string value as a value for an input property, you don't need that property binding syntax with square brackets, because that would just turn this code between the quotes here into some TypeScript expression instead of a string. And I don't want that here. I want a hard-coded string value instead, so therefore I'm setting this input property like this here. But with that, if you save all that, if you go back and you click that first link and you confirm this, you see my app docs link was added as a query parameter here. If you click that second link and confirm this, you see my app courses link was added as a query parameter. So that works, and it proves that you can add inputs to your directives. However, it is quite common that you want to simplify the usage of attribute directives, and you therefore might want to allow yourself to set that query parameter value like this, as a value for an input that has the same name as your directive selector here. And currently this wouldn't work because we have no input called app_save_link. But of course we could change this name here, or if we want to keep query param as a name here in this class, we could assign an alias by passing this configuration object to the input function and setting an alias of app_save_link, so that this input internally has the name query param, but externally, in the place where the directive is applied, it has this name. And that would now allow us to set the value for this query parameter as a value for an input called app_save_link in the place where we're applying this directive. So with that, if you save this, if you reload, you'll see that still this value is being used. And that's a relatively common pattern when building custom directives, which is why I'm showing it here.